Hey everybody, Paul Mack here. Got another viewer question. This question comes from a viewer named Jesse. He says, hey, got a bit of a can of worms question for you. In the past, I built pole barn structures and have put at least a bag of concrete at the bottom of the hole. Upon doing more research and seeing how they did things in the old days, it seems as though you can just put dirt back into the hole, pack it like really well, and that holds up perfectly fine for a long time. Well, Jesse, yes, that does work, and it has worked for a number of decades for the old-time farmers as well as us new-time farmers. The trick is tamping, T-A-M-P-I-N-G, tamping the dirt in and adding it very slowly, going very slowly. You don't want to fill too much dirt in there and then tamp on the top because the bottom doesn't get tamped. And really that's what a tamp does. A tamp, I'll show you in just a moment, is a big iron rod, basically. They have different shaped ends. Usually one end is pointy. That's for other things. I turn the tamp around, use the blunt end, and that packs in a little bit of dirt at a time. And what you want to do when you're setting a post, either for a pole barn or for a fence post, is, you've got the hole dug. Usually that's anywhere from 2.5 feet to 3 foot, depending on how tall the pole is and the ground you're working in. You dig that post hole, then you set your post in, and as you're putting the dirt back, you don't want to add too much at a time. In fact, I add maybe a shovel or two of dirt into the hole and then tamp really, really well. And then another shovel or two, and then tamp really well, and keep on, so forth, until the hole is basically filled back up to the top and the post is set. Now the problem, this is where most people, I think, mess up with their setting post, is they don't tamp well enough. And if you don't tamp well enough, there's going to be loose gravel down there, loose dirt, whatever you're putting back in, and there's going to be air pockets. And a lot of times people will fill the dirt in to the top and then tamp around the top, and they concentrate on tamping around the top. But what that does is, at ground level just about, the dirt that you've tamped really well is holding that post really well, but there's nothing holding it solidly at the bottom and obviously nothing at the top. And so that post can wiggle, especially over time. And it's my theory that with enough air pockets down there, you're likely to get a little more rot. Of course, depending on what type of tree you're using for your poles. Some are more rot resistant than others, but there's going to be more rot than if you had tamped really, really well. Now, this is a tamp that my father made, I think when I was probably really little, if I was born yet. And he made this it's a piece of steel. He made this out of an old buggy axle. You can see where that end had the nut and held the wheel, and he ground this end down to be pointed, and there you have it. The pointy end I use when I'm digging the hole. If I got a rock in the way, I use it as a pry bar, but this mainly is the business end I use for tamping when I'm tamping down the dirt and making sure that dirt gets packed really, really well. Now keep in mind, the hole that you're digging for that post or that pole needs to be big enough so that you can get the tamp between the pole or the post and the wall of the hole so that you can get in there and work really well. So if your post is a little bigger, your hole needs to be bigger to accommodate that. And also, sometimes posts have knots on the side or limbs. You need to cut those, trim those smooth with your chainsaw or with a handsaw or whatever, so that that tamp doesn't have an obstruction when you're tamping down that post. Another thing that you can do that helps, especially on cedar poles, a lot of times we use cedar trees to make posts or poles for our pole barns like I have here. And another tip for that is to, with an axe, chop off the sapwood, and that's the yellow part. The best part, the part that's rot resistant and insect resistant, is that pink part. So if you put a post in the ground over a period of, it could be as soon as a couple of years, that sapwood is generally going to rot away. But as long as you tamp good, you'll have a nice post. On fence posts, a lot of times if the cedar's big enough, I'll half it, quarter it, eighth it, and there'll be enough heartwood there that the sapwood that rots is negligible. It's not going to loosen your post too badly. On pole barn structures, a lot of times I'll go ahead and chop that sapwood off. On my first barn in Tennessee, I left the sapwood on. After a couple of years, you could run a screwdriver at ground level. You could run a screwdriver through the sapwood, but the heartwood, the pink part, was still really, really solid, and it held up really well. On pole barns, generally, it's the upper framework that's holding it all together anyway. So even if there's some rot with the sapwood, everything up top is going to hold it together. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Jesse goes on to say, I have been doing a mix of tamping in dirt and then tamping in pea gravel. I had a couple of people recommend that to me. A couple of old timers who said if you use gravel like that, there's no way that post is ever going to move. I would agree with that. If you've got the gravel and you can mix it in with the dirt you're using, it's all the better. In fact, even larger rocks, as long as they're not so large they get in the way with your tamping. You still need to tamp, no matter what you're putting in, whether it's pure topsoil or subsoil and topsoil or pea gravel added in, you're still going to have to tamp really, really well. So remember that. Furthermore, Jesse goes on to say, I have been using this method on my fence, but I have added a bag or two of concrete here and there for spots that I had a little extra concern about. I have seen barns that I know from the families who owned the land. The barns were built in the early 1900s and some in the 1800s that are still standing and seem perfectly stout. I highly doubt concrete was used in all of these. And yes, I highly doubt it was either. And as Jesse noted, those barns are still standing fine after decades and decades of use. And so it comes right down to, again, tamping those in very, very well. Now, as far as using concrete is concerned, and I bet you what Jesse is referring to here is that most hardware stores, you can go and buy about an 80-pound bag of concrete mix that's pre-mixed. It's got everything in there. All you do is like instant coffee. Just add water, preferably not boiling hot water, but just add water. You mix it up. But in this situation, what most people do in pouring concrete into the holes is they pour it in there dry. They set the post, maybe add a little bit of dirt, and then pour the dry concrete mix into the hole to the top and just leave it and let the rain and the moisture from the ground turn that concrete hard. And it does set the post very, very well. I myself, there's only 2 times that I tend to use concrete in that way, and that's if I run into problems where I can't do it the normal old-fashioned way. For instance, if there's a bog, if you're fencing, I had a situation down just below my milking barn when I built the lot to the milking barn, and just downhill, by the time I finished digging the poles, which were about 2.5, 3 foot deep, I was striking water. I wish it were oil. It wasn't. I was striking water, and the bottom of the hole was filling up with water, and it got to where the last few handfuls of dirt were just mud, and it was turning into be a mess. And the walls were, it was a very wet situation. The walls were muddy, and basically the dirt I was pulling out was too wet and would have been muddy for days, and there was nothing to fill I wasn't going to fill it back in with mud. That would be a mistake. Don't ever use mud to fill back in a post hole or for a pole, because it's not going to work. When the water leaves, it's a mess, and your poles will really move for sure. In those situations where I felt like that area was going to stay moist for most of the year, I used dry concrete, poured that in there, set the post as best I could, and make sure it was straight, because once it dries, you're not going to correct that anymore. And so went on from there. The other time that I use concrete when I'm setting post is if I run into an obstruction, which prevents me from digging the hole as deep as it needs to go. For instance, a 12-inch hole is not going to be good for setting a 14, 16-foot pole for a pole barn you're going to be digging. There was an instance back in Tennessee at our old property where I was building my first pole barn, and there was an old field line from an old septic system that we weren't using anymore. and the field line, the grass had grown over. I had no idea where the field line pipes were running, but invariably, wouldn't you know it, I'm digging like what, nine post holes for the poles for the barn, and when you know it, just about every other hole I was running into the field line. That's the way things go for me sometimes. And so you'd go down about 12 inches, and then you would run into the gravel, the rather large gravel with no dirt. It was just clean gravel, and the hole started caving in. The gravel started caving in. Wasn't a whole lot I could do but get it as deep as I possibly could, put the pole in as upright as I could. Maybe I might have even braced it upright, and then put the concrete around it to hold it firm. So, and sometimes, you're fencing in woods, and invariably you're going to run into the biggest root you've ever seen, and it's going to be really hard to chop that root when it's 2 foot down in the hole. And so there might be instances there where, especially if it's a brace post or a corner post, where you need that to be really solid. With a line post, it may not matter as much, but you got to have those corner posts and brace posts very, very solid. So those are occasions where I might be tempted to use the concrete. The reason I steer away from it is, I guess mainly because it's kind of pricey. Secondly, is because I always think in the future, I may pull this fence up in the future, and when I'm pulling a fence post up, I want it to be easy to come out of there, and the concrete's going to, mushroom out in there, and the dirt's going to settle over it, and it's just going to be difficult. Then what are you going to do? You can't reuse the post because there's concrete all around it, and it's probably pretty hard to break off. It's just, I don't like to think about that. So I'm old school. I just use the tamp, a shovel full of dirt or two at a time, continue to tamp, go really, really slow, and it's always worked out fine for me. Now, Jesse has yet one more question. What are your thoughts about the longevity of building a barn using cedar post or even treated pine post and just tamping in the post rather than using concrete or some other modern method? Will the barn be leaning over in just 15 or 20 years? Your thoughts? Well, Jesse, have always had, as I've said, I've always had quite a bit of success without using the concrete, with just good old-fashioned tamping very slowly, as I pointed out, provided the quality of the poles are good, and provided there's enough heartwood on them too, and that's another thing. There's been times in fencing when I'm running and gunning, trying to go fast, and I'm trying to gather up enough natural fence posts from the cedars on my property, and you're tempted to use the very small, very small trees, which is fine. I've done it. Just keep in mind that those aren't going to last as long as the ones that you cut the quarters in half. They're not going to last as long as those because they just don't have enough heartwood on them. But you know what? They will still hold a staple for a good while. So I have used them, but just keep in mind, the smaller the tree is, it's probably not going to last as long as your other nicer poles. But let's say this, even if you didn't do a good job of tamping in your poles, let's say you're building a pole barn, and you didn't do a very good job of tamping in your poles, but yet they were good and plumb for the most part, and you framed it all up, you had your sills, your loft joist or whatever, and then your roof frame, whether it's trusses or rafters, and eventually the tin that holds all that together, and then your bracing, your 45-degree braces on the post and the sills. Basically, it's the framework. It's the upstairs. It's everything up above the ground that holds that structure together and keeps it from moving. So even if the poles or the sapwood around the poles eventually rots, and you lose that much on, all around the edge, and if the structure wasn't on it and you push the pole or pulled the pole, maybe it would give some, but it's really generally not going to give because of the framework up above. And generally, as I said earlier, that's the thing that pretty much holds the building together. In fact, all the barns you were talking about a while ago, all the old barns, if you were to remove all the framework, it could very well be that those posts give a whole lot more than they did 50, 60, 80 years ago when they were first built. But that's just the nature of it. It's generally the framework and everything up above the ground that holds it all together. If you want to know more about building I've got a video on building a pole barn without using poles. It's actually, which is technically not a pole barn, but the principles are the same. You can put the poles up on concrete piers and do it that way, which basically is kind of a frame barn, but for the most part, it still has the feel of a pole barn. It has poles on each sill. If you want to know more about that, check out the video. I'll have a link to it below. The name of it was Building a Pole Barn Without the Poles, which is an interesting title, but check that video out if you want to know more about that. You can also watch my video playlist on building an old-fashioned pole barn. There's, I think, it's a 6-part video. You can watch all those and learn a lot about building your own pole barn, even if you're not a carpenter. And if that weren't good enough, remember, I've got my book, Building an Old-Fashioned Pole Barn. I'm going to have the link in the description below. If you're a farmer and you have a need for a larger structure to house animals or feed, or animals and feed, or hay, a loft, no loft, equipment, whatever. If you need a pole barn, but you've never built something that big, this book is for you. It's written not for carpenters, not for professional carpenters. It's written for farmers who just need a building. So, Building an Old-Fashioned Pole Barn. Again, the link will be in the description below. I guess that'll about do it for this question and answer edition. I'm Paul Mack. If you have a question that you'd like answered on the show, anything about the farm, maybe it's another question about pole barns and building pole barns, just leave it in the comment section below. I enjoy reading those, and if it's a good enough question and I feel like a lot of people will benefit from it, we'll cover it in a future Q&A. So, until next time, I'll talk at you later. Jacob Ciparano, you realize you're inflating the prices by suggesting everyone buy 2. Whoops.